I don't know, but like I feel like if I am only gonna do one more today, it would be smarter to prioritize D-Day, the 4-parter D-Day. It's generally considered one of the most significant points in the war, so it seems like the way to go. So I'm going to set that up now, and the others, there will be a time and place for Defense of Poland and Battle of Saipan. I'm sorry if you guys wanted to see those, and I'm putting those aside, but I would like to do D-Day. And if there's any chance of me losing my headphones in the middle of a series, I'd rather I'd gotten D-Day done. So we're gonna be doing that. I'll have to fix the thumbnail afterwards and take the series I'm not doing out of the thumbnail because I don't want people to be misled in the future. I have done my best to get as much done as possible, but here's where we are. So we're gonna be skipping ahead to D-Day. So hopefully we didn't miss too much. We definitely missed a good amount.
When the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
That signal
Churchill.
comes today.
Like, I don't know if they've done that before, done like actual sound bites from the people that they're talking about. I don't know how. This is one of those cases where they actually have a really good sound bite from one of the people that they're discussing. A lot of this stuff they cover would have been before, like that sort of recording would have been widespread, or just predating that sort of stuff in general, so that you wouldn't have those audio files to work with. But this is clearly one that that's interesting. But I've never seen them do anything like that before.
This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks.
I just watched a historian react to the extra credits of D-Day, and he was super critical, saying it was simplified to the point of being outright wrong all over the place. Well, we're gonna go for it. Of course, there will be opportunities to refine my understanding of D-Day and all that, but we're gonna go for it.
Tank,
We'll see
use
what
the
it's
code
got.
Neptune for free goodies. Link.
You're gonna find things oversimplified. This is why you should read a book. And watching videos online is fun, but it's no substitution for a book.
In the description. D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Months of effort have been building up to this day. Throughout England, 500,000 men have been gathered at staging areas to strike across the Channel as soon as the signal is given. Men from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Poland. Today, we'll be telling the American story, as best it can be told in a few short minutes, and over the coming weeks, thanks to the generous support of Wargaming, we will tell the story of 3 of the other major players involved. But that story begins with a dinner in Tehran in 1943. For the first time, the leaders of the most powerful Allied nations, the United States, the USSR, and the British Empire, met in one room. For years, Stalin, his nation battered by the Nazi invasion and bearing the brunt of the human cost of the war against Germany, had pressed the Allies to open up a second front to the war by invading France.
So this is during one of these meetings, I believe, is when the atomic bomb is like discussed finally, in like sort of an open fashion. Finally, I believe, like not open to the public, but between like the Allied leaders, I believe. I don't know if it's during this point or another point.
The British had pushed back, arguing for operations in North Africa, and then an assault on Italy. But now, with the USSR winning on the Eastern Front, the demands from Stalin became harder to deny, and simultaneously, everyone started to think of the post-war settlement. If the Allies won without British and American troops liberating Western Europe, they stopped the USSR from claiming huge swaths of land and perhaps even, at least politically, dominating the continent.
Oh, we're way early. The atom bomb is 2 years away. Okay. I thought it was at least discussed in the, but yeah, I probably wouldn't have been on the table yet. It was at one of. Okay.
And so an agreement was made out in the deserts of Iran. The Western powers would open up a second front by invading France in May of 1944. Plans were drawn up. An amphibious operation of this size had never been tried. Men and material would have to be drawn back from around the world. New technologies would have to be invented. Engineering feats previously only discussed in conference rooms would have to be put to the test under wartime conditions. But the first decision that had to be made was where to land. There were two possible targets: Calais, the closest point in Europe to England, or Normandy, one of the farthest on the Channel coast. Calais was the sane, sensible place to land, but it had two notable disadvantages. First, terrain in which you could easily get bogged down, and second, the fact that it was the sane, sensible place to land. Reviewing the battle plan, Eisenhower and Montgomery were in agreement. They wanted the element of surprise, with the possibility of being able to rush off the beaches. So the decision was made. Normandy it would be. But this would require one of the greatest counterintelligence operations.
And this is the Eisenhower, as a result of the events of World War II, is like the last US president to really emerge off of the back of his military background. While there are other people who were involved in the military, he was kind of the last one that really rode his military success to the Oval Office, which makes this especially interesting for me as an American. I think Eisenhower is an interesting figure. I don't think I like him. I don't think I like most American presidents, but he's kind of fun to learn about.
Ever attempted to keep the secrets safe, not to mention the equipment and the manpower on an even greater scale. Entire harbors had to be fabricated which could be shipped over from England. More landing craft needed time to roll off the factory lines, so the operation was delayed until June. Finally, the day arrives, June 4th, 1944. Planes prep, final drills are run through, tens of thousands of men board ships for the invasion, and then the rain starts to roll in. Soon it becomes a storm. Ferocious waves sweep the channel. Clouds completely block the sky. High winds buffet any craft that ventures on sea, land, and especially air. Eisenhower is forced to make the decision. The attack must be delayed. Rain continues to pour the next day. A council of Allied commanders is called. If they delay again, they won't be able to launch until July. They need to do the channel crossing at night. They need to do commando raids and minesweeping when the unsuspecting Germans will have the fewest patrols out. But for a crossing of this magnitude, they need nearly full moon visibility. Even if they did decide to brave a launch without the full moon, tidal conditions wouldn't be right for another 2 weeks. What do they do? They've got thousands of men already holed up on boats, getting seasick and nervous and just plain stir-crazy. They've already started moving equipment and forces into staging areas which can clearly only be targeting one place, Normandy. And they've had to alert enough people up and down the chain as to the nature of the operation that with each passing day, the odds of keeping their landing location a secret plummet. But to cross in this weather, that would be madness. Then a captain is ushered in. He's an RAF meteorologist, and he is about to make what may well be the most consequential weather report of all time. He says he believes it's going to be clear on the 6th. Eisenhower nods. The operation is a go. 6,000 ships begin to steam across the channel. Minesweepers fan out ahead of them, clearing a path. For weeks, the Allied forces have bombed the German Air Force in the region nearly to oblivion. No enemy interceptors exist to spot the waves of gliders and transport planes carrying 17,000 airborne troops. The ships won't reach the beaches until dawn, but the airborne infantry has night work to do. First in are the Pathfinders, the men whose job it is to light the drop zones for all the other parachute infantry. Of the 4 planes carrying these Pathfinders, one overshoots
I never
their
understood
target,
that process.
Another has to bail before ever getting to France, and the remaining 2 kept most of their signaling gear in the ditched plane, leaving them desperately trying to signal the paratroopers by waving flashlights at the passing airplanes. The paratrooper drop goes even worse. Scattered by enemy anti-aircraft fire and blinded by low clouds, paratroopers jump from altitudes that are either too high, leaving them drifting slowly, unable to do anything but watch as enemy guns spit shrapnel up at them, or too low, breaking bones on landing as their parachutes don't have enough time to slow their fall. They're scattered all over, many of them landing miles from their drop zones, some landing in marshes or rivers, others being slaughtered as they drop right into the middle of the enemy. It was a harrowing and confusing night of chaotic firefights and desperate small unit actions. But the more veteran of the American airborne troops, groups like the Screaming Eagles and the 505th, managed to pull together to capture crucial road junctions, communication points, and bridges, and even destroyed some of the artillery batteries that would imperil the landing at Normandy. And they would hold fast, delaying or preventing any counterattack that might sweep the impending invasion back into the sea. Then there's the initial bombardment. Allied bombing runs go astray, causing massive damage to the civilian centers in Normandy, but doing little to weaken the dug-in German positions. As dawn breaks, though, the Allied gunners can finally see their targets, and the bombardment becomes far more effective, softening up the beach for the initial assault. But there's little time remaining until the troops' scheduled landing. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the klaxons sound, and the assault craft are released. They plow through the
Oh, this is the image.
Their tin shells as German fire pours.
This is like the iconic image of D-Day we're getting into right here, which is interesting. We're like right at the beginning, so that's kind of fascinating to me. That we are right at the beginning and we're already kind of there. I don't know what hour it is on the East Coast, but it's 23:48 here, so good night. Well, have a good night, man. It's late for a lot of you. I don't expect you all to stay up for me. The VOD's there or whatever.
Pours down, sinking entire landing craft to the bottom of the sea just off the Normandy coast. Then the assault craft hit the beach, ramps
there
drop,
it is.
men charge out. But on Utah Beach, things have already gone horribly. The men look around them and the terrain's all wrong. They've landed on the wrong beach.
Oh, this isn't it. Oh gosh. Oh, of course. That's why this feels weirdly early, because they're not in the right place.
For the Americans,
that makes sense.
The oldest man in the invasion, and the only general to actually join these ground troops, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., happens to have landed with them. The local commanders ask him what they should do, and living up to his namesake, he simply responds, "We'll start the war from right here." He correctly assessed that the beach that they'd landed on was actually a better, more easily takeable landing point than the one that the senior staff had assigned them. In a miracle of heroism, easily takeable landing point than the one that the senior staff
Teddy Roosevelt Jr. hid his chronic health issues.
had assigned them.
Okay.
In a miracle of heroism and logistics,
so he could land with his troops at Utah Beach. That feels like something he would do. Like his, President Theodore Roosevelt also had his own little health issues, but a lot of what made up the Teddy Roosevelt identity was like sort of him reinventing this modern sense of American masculinity and really adapting to the time, which is an interesting interpretation on masculinity that really emerged with like the Spanish-American War and all of that, where we're entering this modern age where the frontier is disappearing, life feels generally softer, women are trying to get into the political sphere, that's weird, and like this sort of what a lot of people might call a sort of toxic masculinity also kind of emerges along with that like kind of contributes to pulling us into war that we may not necessarily have had to get into.
Logistical coordination, he managed to reroute the entire Utah Beach invasion force to his location, direct the battle, and continuously rally the men as he walked the beach with his cane, waving his pistol. His new Utah Beach would be the first beach successfully overrun, and for his actions there, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Omaha, though, was a different story. Here, the pre-landing bombardment had been even less effective. The seas were choppy, landing craft took on water, and men tried to bail with their helmets. Some of the landing craft sank, and those that landed were filled with retching, seasick men. Much of the armored support that was supposed to follow them foundered in the waves, or simply got picked off as they hit the shore. Soon, the men were all pinned down against a small shingle of land that provided what little cover there was to be found on the beach. Many of the units had taken heavy casualties, and much of the command staff was dead. With units getting washed ashore in the wrong places, or scattered in the desperate scramble to try to get to the small ridge of sand that served as cover, the assault had become hopelessly disorganized. The second wave met with much the same fate. Hopelessly bogged down, withdrawal from Omaha Beach was considered, but it was the vital linking point between the British and American forces. As the day wore on, a number of Ranger units began to rally and scaled the bluffs, finally managing to assault German positions on the heights. At the same time, several of the naval ships came dangerously close to the beach to provide more effective support fire just as the German ammunition began to run out. Even after all of this, Omaha Beach wasn't truly cleared by the end of the 6th. But as the sun began to set on those bloodied beaches, it was clear that the American forces were there to stay. Join us next time as we join the British for their covert efforts to keep the biggest invasion in history a secret.
Okay, so we're switching perspectives. That's fun. That makes things a little bit more interesting. I didn't know they landed in the wrong place. That's interesting. It's so fun not knowing anything about any of this stuff. Gives me somewhere to go.
The south of England had become a vast military camp, jam-packed with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all planning on a trip to the Normandy beaches in the early summer. The job of the British Security Service, MI5, was to make sure that on D-Day, the Germans were looking the other way. If they failed, tens of thousands of men would die.
Jeepers creepers, pumpkin seeds, sir. Sounds,
This episode is sponsored by Wargaming.
pretty spooky.
New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. In August 1942, desperate to score a success in the face of an unending string of military setbacks and defeats, the Allies carried out a daring raid on the French port of Dieppe. But the Germans were ready for them, fortified and prepared for the attack. It was an unmitigated disaster, leaving almost 4,000 Canadians dead on the beaches. This catastrophe convinced everybody that when the real invasion of France came, the Germans must not be prepared for it, or D-Day would mean destruction. This was, of course, going to be a little tricky. By 90 days after D-Day, the US Army alone planned to have 1.2 million men with all of their equipment in France. You can't just hide that under a bit of camouflage netting. And so was born Operation Fortitude, the most ambitious deception plan in military history. The operation wouldn't pretend that there was to be no invasion. That would be impossible. Instead, their goal would be to fool the Germans about how many were coming, when they would land, and where they would land.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, you trick them into thinking you're somewhere else is what I was immediately thinking there. But, you know, mess with their entire perception of it. Go for it.
Around Britain to confuse the Germans. The British Fourth Army was stationed in Scotland, supposedly preparing to attack Norway. General George Patton became the proud commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group stationed on the English coast opposite the Pas de Calais, the closest crossing to France. The British 4th and the U.S. 1st were somewhat unusual armies in that there were no actual people in them. They were completely fake, made up, non-existent. The Allies had no real soldiers to spare. They were all needed in France for the actual invasion. So to get the Germans to fall for this massive bluff, the film industry was called in. They created a brilliant...
I think I heard about this. Okay, this sounds hilarious. I feel like I've heard this element of the story.
An entire dummy army. Wooden aircraft, inflatable tanks, 250 fake...
I've heard about the inflatable tanks. That's one of the big things that I thought was hilarious.
Landing craft. 2 fake corps headquarters were invented, pouring out a constant stream of radio drivel. At one point, King George VI even made an official inspection visit, solemnly inspecting row after row of blow-up tanks and real troops who had been bussed in for the day, all while the daily newsreel broadcast this inspection to the world. George even managed to look
Don't trust
thoroughly
what you see on
impressed.
television,
And
guys.
because you might as well go big or go home, this inflatable first U.S. Army was presented not just as a threat, but as the threat. The primary invasion force to be launched at the Pas de Calais. The Germans already considered this to be the most likely destination for the Allied attack. Now the Allies
Tell 'em what
just
they
needed
already
to
think,
make
I
sure
guess.
that the Germans continued to believe that. And so was born MI5's 20 Committee, so called for the XX Roman numerals, double cross. Double cross fed
Oh,
the Germans
that's
a
cute.
constant stream of highly credible intel, a combination of utter rubbish and brilliant information delivered just too late to be useful. Back in 1939, the British had turned a German agent into a double agent. He was pretty useless, but he had told MI5 everything they needed to know about how the German Secret Service communicated with their agents. The 20 Committee used this information
That seems
to create
useful.
an entire network of double agents. By D-Day, Germany's entire network of spies in Britain was owned by the 20 Committee. One agent was a Catalan codenamed Garbo. Garbo created a completely fictitious network of 27 agents who bombarded the German embassy in Madrid with messages, presenting an utterly convincing and utterly false picture. The real attack, they said, would come in the Pas de Calais. Any other perceived invasions,
Calais.
such as, I don't know, Normandy, whatever, those were feints. If you hear any guns or shouting over there, just relax, it's just the neighbors again, go back to bed. Garbo was good at his job. So good, in fact, that the Germans awarded him with the Iron Cross for his invaluable services. The danger, though,
That's
was
a
that
high
even if they fooled the Germans before
honor.
the invasion, once the Allies landed, the deception would be over. All German military strength in France would be concentrated on Normandy, and the Allies would then...
Biographics has a video about Garbo. It is curious. Biographics, I've not actually checked out their channel. A lot of their stuff has come up for me, but I've never clicked on any of it. I think that might be something fun to check out for the first time, because I've never they've always been there. I just never got around to it. Maybe I'll give them a chance at some point.
no doubt be driven back into the sea.
They seem like they cover not just popular figures, but some slightly more obscure figures, so they've got that going for them at least.
Concentrated on Normandy, and the Allies would then no doubt be driven back into the sea. So, a series of new operations were concocted to convince the Germans that other invasions would follow the first all along the coast of France. Secrecy was critical. To help the invading forces, a complete photographic map of all of the beaches was needed. The RAF and USAAF ran hundreds of photographic missions, but they needed more. So the public were asked to send in all of their holiday beach photos. Then the toy maker Chad Valley was commissioned to take this intel and make a vast map of the operational area in jigsaw puzzle form for easy mobility. The jigsaw map was delivered by two men in two pieces. Neither of them knew which was the real one, and once the delivery was complete, neither was allowed to leave headquarters until D-Day was over. The British Armed Forces were obsessive about security. They arranged for 30 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force to dress in civilian clothes and visit pubs close to where the British commandos were staying. Their job? To flirt with the men and try to get them to spill some information about their mission. To everybody's amazement and delight.
Oh, is the Biographics guy that Simon dude? Is he that guy? Because I've seen like some of his channels. He clearly is doing like everything. That would be interesting. I think I've seen one video of his. It's the guy with the bald guy with glasses. It's not a very good description, but I think it's that guy. Is it? Because that feels about right.
The commandos kept quiet. MI5 still worried that the news was out though, and that the Germans would be ready and waiting. Back in 1942, the crossword in the Daily Telegraph newspaper had included a clue answered by the word Dieppe, just one day before the Dieppe raid had taken place. Worrisome. And now, on May 2nd, in the same crossword section came the clue, one of the US. And the answer was Utah, the code name for one of the beaches the Americans were to land on. Then, on the 22nd of May,
there we go.
came the answer Omaha, another beach. And then later, Mulberry and Overlord and Neptune, all code words for various D-Day operations. Finally, MI5 descended in a fury upon Leonard Daw, the schoolmaster who wrote these crosswords. Turns out that it was all just an extraordinary series of coincidences. But the big question remained, had all of this deception and secrecy worked? And
It is
how
the
would
Simon
Allies
guy.
know
That's
if
what I
it
thought.
had? They needed to be able to read German communications to be sure. The Germans used an extraordinarily complex encoding system, Enigma. The codes were changed daily, and there were 159 million possible permutations. German messages should have been impossible to read, but the British thought that they could crack the code. They assembled a team of brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing at Bletchley Park to do it. Then the Allies had a lucky break. In May of 1941, a British ship forced a German U-boat to the surface. The Germans abandoned their sinking craft, but in the final moment, the British sailors managed to board and capture the most unimaginable treasure. A completely intact code machine and code books.
Oh, dude, that's a game changer.
The British were routinely reading German messages. One estimate has suggested that the intelligence gained from this find may have shortened the war by more than 2 years. It was through that intelligence that the Allies learned that the 20 Committee had been stunningly successful. When the balloon finally went up, every key German commander greeted the news of operations in Normandy as an invasion, but not the invasion. Critical German focus, men, and material remained on the Pas de Calais even after D-Day, confusing, slowing, and weakening the German response. It was little short of a miracle. And so D-Day began for the British and Canadian forces. The British beaches were called Gold and Sword, and the Canadian beach Juno. Churchill had insisted on proper names rather than silly code names, saying that no mother wanted to hear that her son had given his life at the Bunny Hug landings. The British parachute drop, despite massive confusion, achieved most objectives in the face of incredible odds.
Don't obsess over optics, Churchill. I understand that optics sometimes matter in war, but I think in this case it might be worth, you know, taking that stuff pretty seriously. Make up some code names, man. Like, it's fine. Clearly it'll be okay.
A complete glider train
You'll
of
win.
artillery were supposed to be sent to capture a critical German battery, but when all of the equipment and most of the men were lost in the landing, the 150 remaining soldiers, armed only with rifles and Sten guns, took the battery nonetheless. It's 7:25 a.m. at Sword Beach. Mine-clearing tanks thrash the sand. Sappers run beside them to disable mines and obstacles, frequently falling to enemy fire along the way. Then come tanks and flamethrowers throwing themselves at the German defenses on the dunes. And only then come the landing craft to release their cargoes of men. In the chaos, the schedule collapses in only half an hour. The beach has become a tangle of men, machinery, twisted wreckage, a chaos of dead, dying, and living. The air is filled with the roar of gunfire. Every moment is a drama of comedies, tragedies, and moments of heroism. But despite the cost, the landing at Sword was remarkably successful. By 9
Like, the amount of movies that have depicted this stuff is absolutely insane. With so, like, it's so easy to picture, like, some version of these events. However, I feel like often the first thing that comes to mind is a bit of a dramatized depiction of it, but there's got to be some, one might think there's got to be some degree of reality behind a lot of that.
PM, many units were off the beaches and moving inland. At Juno,
I know some of it's
Canadian losses
definitely
were
BS,
heavier,
but whatever.
They soon broke through the coastal defenses, as did the British at Gold. The landing plan had worked amazingly well, considering. Almost everywhere, the German coastlines had been rolled up, and the Allies had complete control of the air. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Now
I know what that means
to
now.
strike hard and fast into the interior, to exploit the Germans' shock and seize the vital objectives, including the major town of Caen. There was a period of calm as men brewed up to recover from the initial assault, and then they moved inland to link up with the airborne units. Unfortunately, the beachheads behind them were a massive traffic jam. The roads were chaos, and their armor support was still fighting their way through that traffic to reach them. And the Germans continued to fight hard. Key strongpoints resisted and slowed the British and Canadian infantry's advance. At 6 p.m., a unit of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry came under heavy fire 3 miles short of Caen and dug in for the night. With little armored support, pressing the attack and capturing the town was not an option. That night, men lay across a 60-mile stretch with their weapons, peering into a darkness lit by flares, tracer, and shells. D-Day had been a remarkable success, but as elite German divisions approached, the fight for Normandy was about to begin, and it would be harder than any could imagine.
We're just now getting started, DJ. Yeah, D-Day. A lot of resistance. So does that mean we're... Oh, is this just gonna... So this is just like a different perspective each episode. Like we started with like an American perspective, then we went to like a purely British one, and now we've got to go to occupied France. Of course, there's gonna be some sort of an internal resistance here. You haven't completely Nazified France overnight. You couldn't. That would take generations. So that must be where we're going here.
1944. A group of French farmers huddle around a radio tuned to the London broadcast. If they're caught, they will be thrown in prison, perhaps tortured, perhaps even executed. But they listen anyway, and then they hear it. A
Four different countries'
from a French
perspectives,
poem
okay.
Tossed in amongst 100.
So I assume the last one is Germany. Let's take a look. The Atlantic. Yeah, it's almost certainly going to be Germany. Okay, so we're building it. I'm excited about this one.
Disguised as personal messages. A cheer goes up, and the farmers grab their guns. That was their signal. The liberation starts tonight. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. 4 years before the Normandy beach landings, the French government signed an armistice that turned all of northern France into...
Have I not had my chat on screen this whole time? I meant to, but I guess I never did. There you go, guys. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. I guess I never checked. I mean, I checked. Everything looked fine. I like having the chat there, so you guys can have your stuff. But now we're like right at the end, so would it feel like weird and out of place? Whatever. We're just gonna do it as is. So yeah, man, I always goof something in these streams, but nobody told me.
They insisted that surrender was the only way to save their people from being crushed by the unstoppable German war machine. But from the first moment that German army boots marched down the streets of Paris, resistance groups began to spring up all over France. The early resistance groups were small, disorganized, and independent. They had enthusiasm, but no direction, other than a burning desire to kick the Germans out of the country. And there were not many of them.
That's a lot of French rebellious spirit. Like, I like that spirit, though.
Most citizens chose to put their faith in what remained of the French government, which had fled south to the city of Vichy. They claimed to control unoccupied southern France, but really they just did whatever the Germans told them to do. The early resistance lashed out by attempting to hurt or even kill German soldiers, but all they really managed to do was provoke vengeance. Hitler ordered the mass execution and deportation of several thousand French Jews and communists in retaliation for strikes made by the early resistance groups. The message was clear: if you hurt our people, we will hurt yours more. The resistance needed to find ways to fight back without inviting retribution and making things worse. And things had gotten pretty bad. By now, the German war machine, which had ground up the French armies in less than 6 weeks, had a desperate need for natural resources and industrial power.
And they'll never hear the end of it, will they?
They imposed tight rations on their French subjects and began redirecting all...
Like, I feel for the French, because it didn't take a whole lot for them to go from being like this great imperial power that was taken very seriously on the international stage to being a punchline just based on like the world wars alone. It's like so much of their history had simply been erased and they were just reduced to like these cowards, when I think that's very unfair.
The wealth of France to fuel their conquering army.
I don't like that
so
punchline.
That became the new resistance target. Take out the factories and the railroads so that the Germans couldn't use them anymore. As long as they didn't harm any Germans doing it, the harshest reprisals never came. The British had that same idea. They parachuted agents into France to begin forming resistance networks of their own, recruiting citizens they could trust, and sometimes linking up with existing groups if they could find them. One of those agents would have a radio that could transmit messages back to London, requesting supply drops with weapons and explosives so that the resistance could get to work. But radios powerful enough to transmit across the channel were in pretty short supply. So they turned to Radio London, a public French-language station that had been created specifically to counter German propaganda and organize protests from safely across the English Channel. Radio London began to open and conclude every program with a nonsensical jumble of phrases that it called personal messages, which were actually coded messages for the resistance. The radio operators hiding in France would contact British headquarters with the requested supply drop and give them a random phrase like, "Pierre says hello." Then, instead of resistance members coming back to the safe house for updates every night, they could just listen at home on their radios. If Pierre said hello, they would head to their prearranged drop point. This radio system, the same one that would be used on D-Day to call the Normandy resistance cells to action, was operated by yet another group devoted to the liberation of France, the Free French. Back when the Germans had taken over northern France...
Oh, that's cool. They have their own flag. That's fun. That's an interesting symbol. I'm not sure what that means, but like, I think that's... I love movement flags. Country flags are cool. Movement flags, I think you get a lot of leeway to do some cool things with those. That one's all right.
The liberation of France, the Free French. Back when the Germans had taken over northern France, a little-known general by the name of Charles de Gaulle escaped across the
I
Channel.
know that guy!
He had been appointed to government office only 12 days before,
This is his moment.
himself faced with the prospect of watching his country and the
I
government...
feel ashamed that, like, for so much of my life, all I knew him from was Futurama. I think he was like a recurring... not even character. He was like one of those heads in a jar, and I think he appeared in a couple times.
And he was supposed to serve surrender to Germany. De Gaulle would not have it. He got on the British radio and called for all of France to rise up and fight. He invited all the soldiers who had fled from the invading Germans to join him now in London to regroup and take their country back. And he vowed to keep speaking on the radio, so that those who couldn't leave France would know that the flame of French resistance still burned bright. Inspiring words, but very few people heard them. Most French people weren't exactly in the habit of listening to British radio broadcasts at this point, but those who did began to spread the word. Of 100,000 French soldiers who had escaped to Britain, 7,000 decided to stay with de Gaulle. It was small, but it was a start. And with that start, de Gaulle vowed to take France back from the Germans and the Vichy government that had surrendered to them. He knew that a small force couldn't accomplish that task on its own. He needed to win support from Great Britain and the United States, and he needed to coordinate the...
I freed France from the Nazis, And they just totally make an ass out of him in that episode. And he's like, oh, I am some French guy. That's all I can think of right now. Just how Futurama, like, totally belittled him. But he seems fascinating. He might be somebody worth reading up on more. I think I read up on him a little bit in my freshman year of college, but that's like a lifetime ago.
The scattered groups of the French resistance. Both would prove very difficult. Winston Churchill recognized de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French Resistance group, but he balked at acknowledging him to be the leader of France itself. After all, de Gaulle had never actually been elected leader of France, and now he...
The symbol at the middle of the Free French flag is the cross of Lorraine. Okay. Worth knowing.
Here he was, trying to claim the right to lead a country that he couldn't even set foot in because its official government had sentenced him to death. To make matters worse, de Gaulle had a habit of rubbing President Roosevelt of the United States exactly the wrong way. But that same arrogance that drove Roosevelt away also proved to be the fire that de Gaulle had promised to keep burning for France. Piece by piece, he built a government in exile, appealing to both generals and bureaucrats to abandon the Vichy government and join his cause instead. Because of his determination to push himself forward as the true leader of France, he forced the Allies to treat France as an ongoing partner in the war
that's what that says.
and not as a defunct and conquered nation, like so many others under the German thumb. By 1942, 2 years before the landings at Normandy...
Je suis. That's I am. Or is it we are?
His efforts had begun to bear fruit. He had appointed a leader to coordinate the French resistance cells on his behalf, and succeeded in forming a central committee that pledged its loyalty to him. British agents began to coordinate their own resistance efforts with de Gaulle's Free French, although they didn't trust him entirely. They did keep a few of their networks secret from him. Nevertheless, they worked together to create a detailed set of plans to support the upcoming Allied invasion. They would target crucial railroads, telephone systems, and electrical installations to sabotage the Germans' ability to mobilize their defenses once the Allies landed. And that once small resistance movement had grown enormously over the 4 years of occupation. Now, over 100,000...
Guy fought in World War I was once captured by Germans, yet escaped dressed as a nurse, which was made more hilarious by the fact that he was tall as heck. Okay, that sounds hilarious.
With weapons and explosives that
good on him though. Glad he pulled that off.
Through Radio London. The Allies and the Free French had pushed back on German control in the wider French Empire, winning massive victories in the French colonies of North Africa and proving that a properly organized French army could indeed stand up to the German war machine. The Germans responded to that success by reaching for more control of France itself. They ended any pretense of the Vichy government's independence and overran the southern countryside, which only alienated more French people and bolstered recruitment for the resistance. But Germany's greatest gifts to the resistance were the invasion of Russia and the subsequent labor draft in France. When the Germans broke their uneasy truce with Russia, they galvanized the many communist groups in France to take up arms against them. These new resistance groups never entirely...
Yeah, communism isn't inherently like, it's a little bit like spooky to some people, but there are those ideas like floating around in most European countries. There are at least small sects of communist thinkers. So yeah, okay, that makes sense. I remember when I was reading about like immigration politics during the time, and a lot of Americans were primarily afraid of European immigration because it would bring these new radical political ideas. Communism, Marxism, being some of them, but there's also a wide array of emerging and developing political ideology coming out of Europe at the time. So there's so much that could have come out of it.
Rarely accepted the leadership of the Free French or the British agents, but they were well organized in their independence and made good use of the supplies those agents gave them. Meanwhile, to compensate for the men they had sent away to fight on the Eastern Front with Russia, Germany began to draft young Frenchmen to serve as forced labor in the cogs of their machine. Many fled the draft by running to the only group in France that would fight for their freedom, the Resistance. So when Resistance members gathered around their radios on June the 5th and finally heard the signal words that meant the liberation was on its way, they celebrated and they got to work. In the span of a single day, they took down 500...
The French, out of any country, they know how to do a few things. They know how to mount a sort of resistance. They know how to do internal protesting. They have like a rebellious nature that like is just grounded in their tradition. So if there's any place that you're going to find trouble from within, like France is a dangerous place to have control over, like if they don't want you there.
77 railroads, 30 driving roads, and 32 telecommunications sites. They cut off several panzer divisions from moving north to join the German Defense Force, giving the Allies precious time to establish a beachhead before German reinforcements could arrive. And together with ordinary French citizens, many of whom now flooded to join the resistance in such numbers that the Allies didn't have enough weapons to supply them, they helped guide and support the paratroopers to strike key targets and begin dismantling German control of France. For all of the setbacks and, yes, even the surrender that France faced, it was as de Gaulle predicted in that fateful radio address that first brought together the forces of the Free French. But has the last word been said?
You can't doubt
disappear?
The fire of the French. They got more fire than anyone.
Thanks again to Wargaming for choice.
So I guess this is our last one of today. One is called The Atlantic Wall. This should be the last one today. So let's get into it. So we've gone through the American, British, and French perspectives, and I'm sure there are many other perspectives that could potentially be gotten, but you know, we've also explored a lot of the Soviet experiences through the war and all that. So we've been able to at least touch upon a little bit on a lot of things, which is fun when a lot of these subjects are things that I've not explored all too deeply. So this has been really cool. So we're gonna wrap it up today with probably the most appropriate perspective, and that is the
June
Germans.
6th, 1944 is a day that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been looking forward to for a long time. His wife's birthday. With bad weather
That's not what
making
I
an
thought.
invasion impossible, and intelligence suggesting that Eisenhower's waiting for more troops, the commander of Normandy's defenses has decided to go home and surprise his wife with a pair of Parisian shoes. In the middle of the night, his phone rings. The invasion's begun.
Oh, his life was over. That is
This
awful
episode
for
is
your boy.
sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code Neptune
He's not your boy. I understand this. Like you probably wouldn't be too fond of him.
for free goodies. Link in the description.
He was a Nazi.
The Nazi leadership had begun preparing for D-Day.
I hope he's not your boy.
before the Allies held their conference at Tehran, following a British commando raid at Saint-Nazaire and the landings at Dieppe in 1942. Hitler had realized that even if an invasion lay years off, the Allies were already capable of hitting ports in occupied France. His solution was the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal defenses that originally clustered around ports but eventually stretched from the Spanish border to Norway. Rather than building a continuous defensive barrier, German engineers drafted 1 million forced laborers from France to create a string of machine gun and artillery positions. These hardpoints had overlapping fields of fire, with artillery intended to fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This allowed the German army to cover a larger amount of territory with fewer men, a consideration that was crucially important by 1944. In late 1943, Hitler had appointed Rommel as overall commander of forces in northern France. It was a political as well as practical appointment, leveraging Germany's most famous general in order to reassure the troops and the public. Rommel also had a personal relationship with Hitler, which allowed him to operate semi-autonomously outside the chain of command. When Rommel arrived, he was shocked at the state of the Atlantic Wall. Command had stripped troops for the Eastern Front, and many of the men were either new recruits, conscripts from Eastern Europe, or had gone soft garrisoning the wine-soaked towns of France. Allied bombing had nullified the Luftwaffe.
That's probably the
Rommel went
main
to
perk.
work. He sent veteran units to supplement the poorly trained divisions. He seeded the ground around the defensive emplacements with mines that jumped into the air before exploding. At low tide, he sank a forest of wooden stakes tipped with anti-tank mines that sat just below the waves. Now, any
sick,
invader
brah.
would have to choose between running the gauntlet at high tide or landing at low tide and crossing 300 yards of open beach. He also flooded the Low Country, erected poles to tear apart gliders, and stationed troops inland to slow
Shred.
the Allied advance in preparation for a counterattack. But planning around that counterattack was a problem. First of all, they didn't know exactly where the Allies would land. Luckily, German intelligence pulled off a coup. They successfully deployed multiple agents in England. Soon, they were receiving reports of armies marshalling to attack Pas-de-Calais, along with diversionary attacks in occupied Norway and... what was the other one? Normandy? Whatever. And aerial reconnaissance.
And that's where it's
confirmed
gonna be?
forces
Oh,
massing
geez.
for these attacks. Of course, every
Why didn't they
single
care?
one of those German agents was actually working for the British. Good work, Garbo. Regardless of where the landings took place, Rommel believed the battle would be decided on the beaches. Should the Allies establish a beachhead, it would be over. In his plan, the divisions defending the coast would slow the enemy down in preparation for a decisive counterattack. As a result,
I understand
he wanted
Nazis
the
are never our
reserve
boys.
Under his own command.
I apologize for insinuating that any Nazis would have been any of your boys. They're not my boys, but I don't want you to think that I think they're your boys either.
To sweep the Allies back into the sea. However, Hitler's leadership style...
I talk
started
funny.
to
I gotta
affect
stop talking
strategy.
funny.
From his early days
is
in
too
the
much
Nazi
confusion.
Party, Hitler had promoted a kind of social Darwinism among his staff, giving them overlapping responsibilities and intentionally fostering feuds and competition. This meant that subordinates couldn't amass enough power to challenge him, and it elevated his position as the final arbiter of any dispute.
That's something that FDR did as well. I don't know if for the same purpose. Like, he would give competing people like contradictory orders, to see which one is more effective, and then he would just go with whatever already seems more effective. Like, it's one of those cases where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, but the brain is just waiting to see what happens. So FDR had a strong sense of how to utilize power, similarly to Hitler. And I'm not comparing FDR to Hitler in like a broad sense, just in this more specific sense.
In this case, Rommel was opposed by officers, including the elderly Eastern Front veteran von Rundstedt, who wanted the tank reserves held near Paris. This would keep them flexible in case the Allies landed somewhere unexpected, and shield them from shore bombardment. Rommel countered that the long drive toward the coast would make them vulnerable to air attacks. After fierce debate, they put it to the Führer, who, ever indecisive, created an unworkable compromise. He broke up the reserve, giving Rommel 3 panzer divisions and keeping the larger reserve around Paris as a personal unit, which couldn't be moved without his express permission. Only one of Rommel's divisions, the 21st Panzer, was sent to Normandy. So the stage is set for June 5th, and the weather could not be uglier. With conditions so poor for both sailing and flying, senior officers relax in the knowledge that the Allies will not arrive anytime soon. Many take the opportunity to rush home on leave, and that is when paratroopers start to land.
Oh, jeez.
At 5:30 a.m.
That must
on
be
June 6th,
incredibly
German
difficult.
Soldiers peer out of their bunkers to see shapes in the morning mist, ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Then, aircraft engines. A massive Allied bombardment rocks the ground as bombs, naval shells, and rockets pound French soil. But the bombers drop too far inland. The rockets fall short. Naval guns make little headway against the steel-reinforced bunkers. 1,745 tons of ordnance drop on Omaha Beach without killing a single German. But the roads inland are wrecked. Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider units land between the static units and the reserve, with resistance elements destroying crucial bridges and rail lines, meaning that reinforcements and supplies can't get through. Landing craft begin to plunge toward the shore. On Omaha Beach, the Germans see the first Allied soldiers trudging in the surf. Machine guns open fire. Far away, Allied soldiers lie face down, pinned, as the first wave of mortars and artillery shells fling bodies into the air. Months of preparation mean that German artillery crews have ranged out the beaches and know exactly where to drop their ordnance. The initial slaughter is monumentally one-sided. One American company at Omaha takes 92% casualties. By 1:30 that afternoon, German observers at Omaha report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing.
I like that they put, they say 1:30 that afternoon for us Americans who don't understand how to make the conversion. I know how to make the conversion. It's just like, it takes me an extra second, because I'm not used to telling time like that.
Report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing the Allies back into the sea. But Omaha is the exception. Despite fierce resistance, the British have broken through at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians at Juneau. The botched American landing at Utah has reorganized into a chaotic opportunity. Here, the bombardments have had more effect, and the terrain isn't as challenging, but men still die in droves. The chaos on the beach is mirrored at every German headquarters between Normandy and Hitler's vacation home at Berchtesgaden. Generals argue over whether to commit
I love German in
reserves
words.
and where. Rommel is rushing toward the battle in a staff car,
places.
unable to issue orders. His rival, von Rundstedt, quickly orders the 21st Panzer to meet the British advancing on Caen, and issues orders for the reserve units near Paris to move out. But his orders are countermanded. That unit can only be moved by the Führer's personal order, and Hitler is asleep. Ever since his days as a Bohemian in Vienna, Hitler has always been
I've heard people talk about Hitler's military leadership skills, and this video even referred to him as indecisive. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, or perhaps if there's like a more nuanced way of putting it, it seems like he had a very powerful vision, but his adaptability was not always on point. I don't know. Is that accurate to say? I'm personally not, but it seems like he was better when he was commissioning action, when he was taking the action, but like responding was not necessarily as strong. Like he liked to have his foot forward rather than being on the back foot. Some people work very well on their back foot, and that's where they make some of the more innovative decisions. It doesn't seem, from what I've heard about Hitler, that he had that as much.
A late riser. Rigid procedure dictates that the Fuhrer should not be woken unnecessarily, and even in the face
This
of
is very
invasion,
necessary.
no one wants to break this protocol. After all, what if it's only a diversion? When Hitler eventually wakes at noon, he is thrilled
He's gonna
the
be
invasion has
pissed.
arrived. This, he says, is his chance to decisively crush the Allies. And yet, he delays. It's 4 p.m. before he orders the Panzer Reserve to move out. By that time, the clouds have cleared, exposing the column to Allied air power. So instead of advancing, the unit ends up hiding in the woods until dusk. It will take them 2 days and a night to join the battle. As the Allies overwhelm German defenses and march inland, Hitler spends his day ordering
Incoming V1s made a buzzing sound, so you would have known they were coming,
V1 revenge strikes, not on Normandy, but
leading the British to nickname them buzz bombs or doodle bugs. That is such like a, that's exactly what Americans would assume that British people would call it.
on London, then holds a conference with minor functionaries. When Goebbels shows him the Normandy landings on a map, Hitler exclaims with delight, "Just where we expected them." Goebbels, who has heard Hitler rant for months about how the Allied target would be Calais, simply nods at the Führer's historical revisionism. After all, Hitler is somewhat right, in a way. They all knew that a diversionary landing would happen at Normandy. Probably best to keep the strong units in Calais. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Wall is crumbling. Even at Omaha, the defense has degraded. Ammunition is running out. Artillery emplacements fall silent.
Hitler's military skills have been muddied mostly due to his generals who, after the war, blamed him for everything, including their own mistakes. So there's conflicting accounts out there. I'd imagine with military leaders who have been studied to death, there are still people who are where the jury is out on them despite having tons of information on them. So it's kind of a hard thing to judge. But it seems that a lot of his responsiveness didn't seem to be a strong suit, but I could easily be wrong about that, having less information than many.
Americans begin breaking through and enveloping the casements. At Caen, the Germans see
Do the
one
doodle
last
bug.
opportunity, a
I like
gap
that.
between the Canadian and British lines. A grenadier regiment rushes to exploit it, and by 8 p.m. radios that they're on the beach. With armored support, they can hold. But the Allies have gotten wise. When the 21st Panzer tries to follow, they find themselves running a gauntlet. Fire pours in from both sides. Every minute, another tank explodes. Seeing that the window of opportunity has closed, their commander orders them to halt and dig in around Caen. But the defense is stiffening. All along the battlefront, Allied units begin failing their first-day objectives of advancing and linking up inland. By dusk, the Allies have scattered beachheads, but not much more. Within days, German reinforcements will arrive, and the hedgerows of Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings. D-Day is over, but Operation Overlord could still fail. To win, the Allies are going to have to push just as hard on D-Day +1, and D-Day +2, and every day after that. For all of these forces, American, British Commonwealth, French, German, and Soviet, the fight would continue for 11 murderous months. But the Allies now had a beachhead, and in trying to throw them back, Germany would spend more men, fuel, and equipment that they could ill afford. Allied victory is a long way off, but for the first time, it's in sight.
The German episode is where the historian found a lot of problems. It was really critical, especially the tank battalions and description of Hitler's mindset. All right, that's fair. It's very possible that they goofed on this stuff. I doubt this is the last time we'll talk about D-Day, so hopefully we'll be able to find some new, fresh perspectives. And if there's other stuff, then absolutely. Like, I'm not gonna go quoting this to my friends. Hey, I just learned something. Let me tell you all about it. I've gotten a little smarter about that. At least letting people know. Like, I don't know too much about this yet. But yeah, this was a fun series. I really enjoyed the French one. I think the French one is where I found the most interest. I think it's a very unique perspective. I think the perspective of the occupied is always fascinating.